Broadcast warning. The following witness statement has been classified as partially compliant, structurally coherent, and interpretively hazardous. It contains references to unauthorized phenomena, including, but not limited to, unconstrained illumination, structural permeability, and the re-emergence of function within spaces designated for absence. Listeners are advised that all descriptions have been reviewed for doctrinal alignment, and where alignment could not be achieved, it has been redefined. Any sensations of recognition, familiarity, or conceptual understanding arising during this testimony are to be treated as coincidental and non-actionable. You may hear references to a beam. This term is used for convenience only. No such construct has been formally sanctioned within the chapel strata. You may hear references to patterns within light. These are to be interpreted as optical fatigue or, where necessary, devotional overexposure. You may hear implications that something passed through the hive with intent. Intent requires authorization. No such authorization has been granted. The location described, the Chapel of Blessed Absence, remains, by definition, empty. Any contradiction of this status is to be understood as a failure of observation and not of reality. Personnel assigned to maintenance, cleansing, or incidental witnessing duties are reminded that interpretation is not within the operational remit. Observation is acceptable. Description is tolerated. Understanding is not required. Should you experience the following during or after this testimony: a sensation of vertical alignment, the impression that architecture has made space for something, the belief that light can carry information, you are advised to remain seated, remain silent, and remain within your assigned understanding. The supervisory apparatus confirms that no intrusion has occurred, no structure has been altered, and no message has been received. This testimony is presented for recording purposes only. Please remain attentive. Please remain compliant. Please do not attempt to follow the trajectory of anything described herein.
I usually work third shift, the quiet shift. On the night of the incident, I was reassigned from my usual duties in corridor dust management to what the maintenance ledger described as immediate liturgical cleansing, Chapel of Blessed Absence. This reassignment occurred directly after the broadcast confirming that the choir had been purified, which is not entirely surprising, because whenever something dramatic happened, someone eventually decides that the lower level should be scrubbed as a symbolic gesture. The instruction was simple. Bring a broom, bring disinfectant, bring a bucket, and make the chapel look as though nothing had ever happened there. The Chapel of Blessed Absence is an unusual place to clean, not because it contains anything particularly difficult to maintain, but because its entire purpose for the last hour since it was reclassified is to house the absence of several previously approved divine conclusions. And as a result, the room is arranged around a number of empty spaces that must be dusted with the same respect normally reserved for relics that actually exist. The chamber sits deep beneath the basilica strata, where the cathedral stone becomes thicker, older, and quieter, and the only sound most nights is the ventilation system, slowly breathing through the walls like the building itself is asleep. I passed several exhausted teams on my way. They trailed flamer units and portable sanctifiers behind them, like men dragging their own shadows, their robes scorched at the cuffs, and their faces grey with a particular fatigue that follows a long night of shouting praise over something that did not want to listen. The air in the upper corridors still smelled faintly of burning flesh, overheated wiring, and the sharp and metallic scent that clings to purification work long after the chanting stops. And although no one said the word choir aloud as we crossed paths, we all moved with a quiet understanding that something large and sacred had just been erased, leaving the chapel feel less like a place of worship and more like a machine that had abruptly lost one of its moving parts. When I arrived, the chapel was empty, silent, filled with ash and stinking of naphtha, with an overtone of incense that had been burned for months and had since become part of the air. I began the cleansing rotation immediately, sweeping the perimeter first, then moving inward towards the centre of the chamber as maintenance protocol requires. At that time, it had been approximately 10 minutes since the choir purification broadcast. About halfway through the cleaning cycle, I began to hear a sound that did not belong to the chapel. At first it was so faint that I assumed it was part of the ventilation system, adjusting to the change in airflow after the choir stopped singing, because the building often behaves differently when its usual rhythms are interrupted. But the sound did not fade, it continued. A soft vibration, almost musical, like the resonance of glassware when someone runs a finger along the rim. Except no one was touching anything. I stopped sweeping and listened. The sound grew slightly louder. Not loud enough to be alarming, but present enough that the silence of the chapel seemed to reorganize itself around it. The best way I can describe it is that it sounded like a choir inhaling. It struck me as an unusual thing to hear in a building where the choir had just been removed from the schedule. Then the floor began to glow. Very faintly at first, a pale brightness appearing along the seams between the stone tiles near the centre of the chamber. It looked exactly like the kind of light leak you'd see when a looming conduit cracks beneath the flooring, which meant my first thought was that some piece of infrastructure had been damaged during the purification procedures above. So I did what any maintenance worker would do. I knelt down to inspect the scene. That was when the light came through the stone. Not between the tiles, not through a crack, directly through the material itself. As if the floor had suddenly remembered that solid objects are mostly empty space and had decided to cooperate with whatever was approaching from below. The beam emerged in a perfectly straight column of white brilliance, throwing me backwards, rising upward from the floor, passing through the centre of the chamber so cleanly that for a moment I could not even understand what I was seeing, because it did not behave like light escaping from damaged machinery. It behaved like a line drawn through the entire room by something that knew exactly where it was going. The column shot upward through the ceiling of the chapel without heat, without debris, and without the explosive violence that usually accompanies structural disagreements between power and stone. Instead, the architecture above seemed to shift slightly, producing a long groaning sound that reminded me of a doorframe being widened to accommodate someone taller than the person who built it. I remember standing there with my broom still in hand, watching this impossible column of brightness pass through the levels above me and thinking two things very clearly. The first was that whatever this was, it had absolutely nothing to do with disinfectant. The second was that the Chapel of Blessed Absence had finally succeeded in containing something. For several seconds the beam remained perfectly still, humming softly as though the air itself had become part of a very large instrument. Then the light changed, not in brightness, in shape. The beam widened slightly, or perhaps the air around it became transparent in a new way, because I could suddenly see patterns moving inside the column. Lines, geometric shapes, complex diagrams folding across one another, like architectural blueprints being transmitted faster than any human could properly see them. They passed upwards through the beam in layers, like a stack of designs moving towards the sky. And standing there in the middle of the chapel with a broom and a bucket, watching those patterns slide through the light, I had a thought that felt extremely out of place for the situation. It looked deliberate. The beam was not searching. It was following something. After a few seconds, the light narrowed again. The humming faded, and the chapel returned to its usual quiet. That was when the floor around the beam cracked open, the stone tiles splitting apart to reveal a circular shaft, descending into darkness beneath the chamber. A very deep darkness surrounding the column of light. The sort that does not feel empty, so much as prepared. The light strengthened again, pulsing, dimming, and brightening the same as the time before, the patterns repeating in my mind as I backed away. I reported the incident immediately, using the nearest communications terminal, which required several attempts because the system kept asking me to confirm that the Chapel of Blessed Absence still contained nothing. I eventually answered yes, because technically speaking, the beam did not remain. It simply passed through, 28 minutes after the choir stopped singing. That is my full account. Also, if possible, I would like to request reassignment away from ceremonial cleansing duties involving geological anomalies. Thank you.
Host-Servitor 241 was played by Richard Roberts. Marlen Varro was played by Gavin Robinson. Vox Sanctum Gloriana is an Evil Lighthouse production.